Divine preparation, how God signals your next breakthrough. Introduction. Life, as we know it, is punctuated by moments of joy, triumph, and fulfillment. Yet, equally, if not more so, are moments of trial, adversity, and, inevitably, brokenness. These are not random occurrences. They are not mere disruptions in the course of life. Rather, these seasons of brokenness are divinely orchestrated. In the hands of God, our moments of brokenness become instruments of transformation. Like a skilled sculptor, God uses these periods to mold, prune, and refine us into vessels fit for His purpose. The sanctification process is intensified during these times, revealing to us who we are, who God is, and what we must become. One cannot think of brokenness without recalling the powerful imagery provided by the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament. In Isaiah 64 verse 8, the word says, "Yet you, Lord, are our Father. We are the clay, you are the potter, we are all the work of your hand." This verse lays the foundation of what the season of brokenness entails. It is a season where God, the divine potter, molds us, shapes us, and refines us. The clay does not dictate to the potter how it should be shaped, neither can we, as His creation, demand our process. To be formed in His image and likeness, we must endure the breaking, the remolding, and sometimes even the firing that brings forth our true, refined nature. It's in these periods of weakness and vulnerability that we come to understand the power of God's sovereignty. Our flesh resists it, our pride despises it. We become challenged because this is the point where our will meets God's will. It's uncomfortable and often painful, as God cuts away the things in our lives that no longer belong. These are the areas we might be proud of, the parts of ourselves we often cling to out of a misplaced sense of identity or security. Yet, as much as we might resist, these stubborn aspects of our flesh must be surrendered to the will of God if we are to grow and be molded into His likeness. It is crucial to understand that brokenness is not a state of permanent defeat. In fact, quite the opposite, it is the starting point of elevation. Brokenness prepares us for greatness, for the breakthrough that God has in store. As the late C.S. Lewis eloquently wrote, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. In our brokenness, our spiritual senses are heightened. We hear Him more clearly. We feel His presence more intensely. It is in these lowly states that we are most open to the divine touch, for it strips us of our own self-reliance and opens us up to the transformative power of God. One need only look at the example of Jesus in the crucifixion narrative to see how brokenness aligns us with God's greater plan. In John 12 verse 24, Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." Jesus understood the necessity of His own brokenness, His death, so that life could be birthed in countless others. He embraced His cross, knowing full well the suffering it entailed. Yet, He did so because He understood the divine purpose behind it. We, too, must embrace our crosses, knowing that the brokenness we endure is producing something far greater than we can presently comprehend. This message is not one of despair but of hope. The enemy often tries to deceive us into believing that our trials are a sign of God's displeasure or rejection. But that is far from the truth. Hardships, trials, and tribulations are often the very tools God uses to prepare us for an extraordinary destiny. As C.S. Lewis once noted, hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. This is one of the most profound truths we can hold on to in our times of brokenness. The trials we face are not signs of God's abandonment but rather His intentional shaping and preparation for the breakthrough He has already ordained. Consider the life of Joseph, a man whose story epitomizes the process of divine brokenness leading to divine breakthrough. Sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and thrown into prison, Joseph could have easily believed that God had forsaken him. Yet, through it all, Joseph remained faithful. He understood that his suffering had a purpose, even if it wasn't immediately clear. In Genesis 50 verse 20, after all he had endured, Joseph says to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." The brokenness Joseph experienced was not the end of his story, it was the catalyst for his elevation and the fulfillment of God's promise. When we embrace our seasons of brokenness with this understanding, we shift our perspective from one of despair to one of hope. We begin to see that God is not punishing us but preparing us. He is not breaking us to destroy us but to rebuild us into something far greater. It is in these moments that we learn to depend entirely on Him, to trust His timing, and to surrender fully to His will. C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, offers this insight. Christ says, "Give me all. I don't want so much of your time and so much of your money and so much of your work, I want you." It is this complete surrender that God seeks from us in our moments of brokenness. It is not enough to offer God our service, our money, or our time. He wants all of us, our hearts, our minds, our wills. And often, it is only in our brokenness that we come to understand the depth of this surrender. It is in these moments that we are stripped of our pride, our self-reliance, and our false sense of control, and we are brought to a place of complete dependence on God. This process of brokenness is not easy. It is not pleasant. But it is necessary. Just as a seed must fall to the ground and die before it can produce a harvest, so too must we undergo seasons of dying to ourselves if we are to produce fruit for the kingdom of God. The Apostle Paul understood this well when he wrote in Galatians 2 verse 20, "I have been crucified with Christ and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave Himself for me." Paul understood that true life, eternal life, could only come through death, through a complete surrender to the will of God. It is in this surrender that we find true freedom. For it is only when we let go of our own desires, our own plans, and our own understanding that we make room for God's perfect plan to unfold in our lives. And while this may require seasons of brokenness, we can rest in the assurance that God is working all things together for our good. Romans 8 verse 28. He is the master potter, and we are the clay. In His hands, even our brokenness becomes beautiful, a testimony of His grace and power at work in our lives. As we delve deeper into the process of brokenness and the transformative work of God in our lives, let us remember this: brokenness is not the end. It is the beginning. It is the place where God meets us in our weakness and turns it into strength. It is the process by which we are transformed from vessels of dishonor to vessels of honor, fit for the Master's use. And it is through this process that we are prepared for the breakthrough that God has already ordained for us. As C.S. Lewis wisely said, we are not necessarily doubting that God will do the best for us, we are wondering how painful the best will turn out to be. But in the end, the pain is worth it, for it leads to glory, both His and ours. The process of brokenness, a path to glory, 6,500 words. In every Christian's journey, there will inevitably come a time when the soul feels crushed under the weight of trials, heartaches, and disappointments. This is not a punishment from God but a divine process, a sanctification that intensifies as we draw nearer to Him. The process of brokenness is one of the most misunderstood and overlooked aspects of the Christian walk. Many associate it with shame, failure, and defeat. But in reality, it is the very place where God does His greatest work in us. It is a season of cutting away, of pruning, of reshaping, and ultimately of preparation for greater things. Let us look closely at the words of C.S. Lewis, who noted in The Problem of Pain, "We can ignore even pleasure. But pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world." What Lewis so brilliantly captures here is the divine purpose in suffering. Pain has a way of getting our attention in ways that comfort never could. When everything is going well, we often become complacent, self-reliant, and inattentive to the voice of God. But in our brokenness, when everything seems to be falling apart, we are finally able to hear Him clearly. Our hearts are softened, our ears are opened, and our spirits are made ready to receive His transformative touch. The nature of brokenness. In Jeremiah 18 verse 6, God says, "Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand, Israel." This imagery of the potter and the clay provides us with a profound understanding of God's role in our brokenness. Just as a potter must mold, press, and even break down the clay before shaping it into a vessel of honor, so too does God use the trials and hardships of life to refine and reshape us. Brokenness is not an indication of God's absence or displeasure, but rather a testament to His intimate involvement in our transformation. He sees in us what we cannot see in ourselves, and He is committed to molding us into His image, even if the process involves breaking. The clay does not resist the potter's hands, it yields. In the same way, we are called to yield to God's hands in our seasons of brokenness. This is perhaps one of the greatest challenges for believers because it requires complete surrender. When we are broken, we must give up control, let go of our own plans, and trust in the sovereign wisdom of God. Like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, who prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done," Luke 22 verse 42, we must lay down our own desires and submit fully to the will of the Father. Biblical examples of brokenness leading to breakthrough. Throughout the Bible, we see countless examples of men and women who were broken before they experienced breakthrough. These stories serve as reminders that brokenness is not the end, but the beginning of a divine process that leads to transformation and elevation. Joseph, as mentioned earlier, Joseph's journey to the palace was one marked by intense brokenness. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned, Joseph endured unimaginable hardship. Yet, through it all, he remained faithful to God. His brokenness was the pathway to his ultimate breakthrough, as he was eventually elevated to a position of power in Egypt, where he saved many lives during a time of famine. Joseph's story teaches us that God can use even the darkest seasons of our lives for His greater purpose. Moses' life was also marked by brokenness. After killing an Egyptian and fleeing to the wilderness, he spent 40 years tending sheep, an exile from the royal life he once knew. But it was in this place of humility and brokenness that God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses' time in the wilderness was not wasted, it was a time of preparation. God was molding him into the leader He needed him to be. The brokenness Moses experienced was necessary for the breakthrough that would follow, the deliverance of God's people from slavery. King David, known as a man after God's own heart, experienced profound seasons of brokenness. Before becoming king, David was anointed by God, but he spent years fleeing from King Saul, who sought to kill him. David's brokenness, marked by betrayal, loneliness, and despair, was part of God's process to shape him into the king He had destined him to be. David's psalms often reflect his heart's cry during these times of brokenness, yet they also reveal his unwavering trust in God. In Psalm 34 verse 18, David declares, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." This verse is a powerful reminder that God is near to us in our brokenness and that He is actively working to bring us through it. Jesus, the ultimate example of brokenness leading to breakthrough, is found in Jesus Christ. His crucifixion was the epitome of brokenness, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. As He hung on the cross, bearing the weight of the world's sin, it appeared as though defeat had come. Yet, it was through this very act of brokenness that the greatest breakthrough in history occurred, the resurrection and the salvation of all who believe. Jesus' death and resurrection demonstrate that brokenness is not the final word, it is the pathway to eternal victory. The purpose of brokenness. Understanding the purpose of brokenness is key to enduring it. God does not allow us to go through trials without reason. Each season of brokenness has a divine purpose, and while it may not be clear at the time, hindsight often reveals the profound work God was doing in our lives. Brokenness serves several purposes in the life of a believer. Refinement. Brokenness refines our character. Just as gold is purified by fire, so too are we purified through the fires of trial. In 1 Peter 1 verses 6-7, the apostle writes, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." God uses seasons of brokenness to refine our faith, to strip away impurities, and to make us more like Christ. Dependence on God. Brokenness brings us to a place of complete dependence on God. When we are at our lowest, we come to realize that we cannot rely on our own strength or wisdom. As Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12 verses 9 to 10, "But he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." It is in our moments of weakness that God's power is most evident. Brokenness humbles us and teaches us to lean on God rather than ourselves. Preparation for greater work. Often, brokenness is the precursor to a greater work that God is preparing us for. Just as Joseph had to endure years of hardship before becoming a ruler in Egypt, and Moses had to spend time in the wilderness before leading the Israelites, we too must go through seasons of preparation before stepping into the fullness of what God has called us to do. Brokenness prepares us for the weight of the calling that God has placed on our lives. How to respond in times of brokenness. Our response to brokenness determines whether we emerge from it stronger and more refined, or whether we allow it to defeat us. The Bible provides several key principles for how we should respond when we find ourselves in seasons of brokenness. Trust in God's sovereignty. One of the most important things we can do during times of brokenness is to trust in God's sovereignty. Even when we don't understand why we are going through a particular trial, we can rest in the knowledge that God is in control. As Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6 reminds us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." Trusting in God's plan, even when we can't see the outcome, is essential to enduring seasons of brokenness. Remain faithful. It can be tempting to give up or lose hope during times of brokenness, but we are called to remain faithful. Like Joseph, Moses, and David, we must continue to walk in obedience to God even when the path is difficult. In Galatians 6 verse 9, Paul encourages us, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Our faithfulness in the midst of brokenness is often what leads to our breakthrough. Seek God's presence. Brokenness is an opportunity to draw closer to God. In Psalm 34 verse 18, David writes, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." God is near to us in our times of brokenness, and He invites us to seek Him with all our hearts. Through prayer, worship, and reading His Word, we can experience His presence and find strength and comfort in Him. The breakthrough after the brokenness. As we walk through the process of brokenness, it's important to remember that there is always a breakthrough on the other side. Just as the crucifixion was followed by the resurrection, so too will our seasons of brokenness be followed by seasons of restoration, healing, and elevation. The breakthrough may not come in the way we expect, but we can trust that God's timing and His plans are perfect. In Isaiah 61 verse 3, God promises to give beauty for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. This is the promise of restoration that God gives to all who endure seasons of brokenness. He will not leave us in our broken state. He will rebuild, restore, and elevate us in His time and in His way. Conclusion. Seasons of brokenness are not easy, but they are necessary. They are the crucible through which God refines, transforms, and prepares us for greater things. As we navigate these seasons, we must remember that brokenness is not a sign of God's absence or displeasure. It is a sign of His deep love and commitment to molding us into vessels of honor. Through the examples of Joseph, Moses, David, and ultimately Jesus, we see that brokenness is always followed by breakthrough. When we trust in God's sovereignty, remain faithful, and seek His presence, we position ourselves for the elevation that follows the trial. God is the master potter, and we are the clay. Though the process of being shaped, pressed, and broken may be uncomfortable, we can trust that the end result will be a life that reflects His glory. Let us, therefore, embrace the seasons of brokenness, knowing that they are part of God's greater plan for our lives. And let us hold fast to the promise of Isaiah 61 verse 3, that for every ash of brokenness, God will give us beauty, joy, and praise. The breakthrough is coming. We need only to trust, endure, and remain in the hands of the potter. Kindly subscribe, like, follow, comment, and share.